On the 30th of September 1980, farmer George Blackwell had an incredible experience here at the property known as White Acres in Kilmany in East Gippsland. Follow us as we explore what happened on that very extraordinary night. So on that night in September 1980, George went to bed at about 10:30, which was his normal bedtime, and he slept very well until about 1 a.m. when he was awoken by the sound of all his cows going absolutely crazy, and a little horse that he had too, which was also running around anti-clockwise in her paddock and going absolutely crazy. So George got out of bed and he came up to this doorway, and in front of it there's a little shed and a little overhang, and there was a rail here at the time. So he climbed up onto the rail to look over the top of the shed here to see what the commotion was about. And now he saw the horse running anti-clockwise around in her field, and she wouldn't respond to any of his calls whatsoever. And as he looked over, he saw this strange object come up between the cypress trees and a shed, and he watched as it turned and went down the laneway to hover over a distant tank. So this was what happened at 1 o'clock in the morning here at this property. He came out through this doorway and the adventure began. This is the other side of the small shed that George had to look over. So he hopped up on the rail, he looked over. Now this big shed that's here now, just turn the camera around, this big shed was not here at the time. So behind me was where the horse was located, down here. Now these big yards were not here at the time, but there was a set of rails here at the time, and that's all been basically taken away. So the horse was down here. I don't think the horse was in the yard, but the horse was in this paddock back here. And the horse was running around with its head in the air, going anti-clockwise around in the paddock, and it just would not respond to George for no matter what he said to it. And through the shed here, we can see this big row of cypress trees here. And that's where he saw something really strange. So here we are down a little bit closer, next to where the trees were, and just behind this big shed which has been built since, certainly wasn't there in 1980, we'll see some of the original shedding that was here back then. And the object came straight up through here. The trees were here on this side, the sheds were over here, and they came straight up. So this is the direction that the UFO came up from, the southwest, and you can see the cypress row just off on the right. Now as I pan around slowly, you'll also notice that this shed, the shearing shed, was definitely there at the time. So the UFO passed up between this shed and the cypress trees. This silo was really the corner point as to where the object turned, around this direction back here, where we're going to end up pointing towards the little laneway. This shot also gives you a pretty good perspective. Now the UFO was about 8 meters across and about 4 meters high, and it came through at only about 8 feet off the ground, and this was making this terrible screaming noise. And that's what George was hearing, what the stock, the little horse off to the right, and the cows further afield, they were really distressed badly by this object that came up through here from the southwest. So now I'm standing at the point where the object made its turn to the right and started heading down the lane. Coming up through those trees and the old shearing shed at the back, it made its way up here, and as that tree line appears here, and just where that green trailer is coming into screen with the hay bales, that's the laneway that leads down to the tank. So after George had seen this happen, he thought, I'm going to hop on my bike and go out and see what this object is and why it's spooking all my stock. So he went back inside from here and he got changed, and it took him about 5 minutes to get from his sleeping attire into his work clothes again. And he had his little Suzuki motorbike, which would have been parked under here, and he hopped on the bike and he went down towards the first gate. So this was the first gateway that George came to and had to open when he hopped on his motorbike and headed out to see the object down where the tank is located. And as he got here to this gateway, one of his old cows was stuck up right in the corner here. Now this cow had a broken leg and it just spent most of its time grazing up and down the alleyway here. Now, nothing would move that cow, George said on many times. But this object, this UFO that came through here where I'm standing now, it must have terrified that old girl. Because even though her leg had been broken, and she didn't walk very far, she was standing right at the gate, and when he opened it, she came charging past and went and hid in one of the small sheds. And she didn't come out of that shed until 4 o'clock the following afternoon. So George hopped on his little Suzuki 100 and he headed down this lane. Now the tank at the time was made of concrete and it was about half a mile from the house. And you might be able to make it out just in the distance here as I walked down this laneway. He travelled along here on his little bike and he said he was in about second gear. So he was probably running at maybe around about 40 kilometres an hour as he came down here at about just after 1 o'clock in the morning. So he was very, very concerned about the stock. That's what got him out. And he could see this object that was hovering over the tank, and then it landed on the ground nearby. So, like any good farmer would, he got on his bike and he went down this little laneway to see what was going on. After it all came out to light and it had been reported in the Gippsland Times, Channel 9 came here with their helicopter and they flew up and down this laneway about 2 or 3 times with the helicopter, trying to see if the object had dropped or left anything as it headed down to the water tank. All along the left-hand side of the little laneway, there used to be calving sheds, and there was about 5 of them from the front gate that we just came through right down to where the laneway ends. They're all gone now, but they were here at the time. Now the cattle were so spooked that they had run through all the fences and they'd split up and they'd come all the way down to here, and they all bunched up in this corner, and that's where George had heard them all bellowing and carrying on down at this particular point in the farm. And as you can see, it's also extremely close to the highway here, the Princess Highway. So very interesting that the cows were that terrified that they sprinted off all the way over here. Now, funnily enough, halfway down to where the water tank was, there actually is 2 dams. And it was always a bit of a mystery why the object didn't stop and hover over the dams. Instead, it made its way down to the little water tank over there in the distance. So why did it not stop and drain the water out of the dams? I have a theory on that, and what I think might have happened was perhaps the object knew that the water in the tank might be purer than the water in the dams, not having sticks and all other sorts of stuff that it might have sucked up with it. Just a theory that I have. George must have been really puzzled as he rode his little Suzuki 100 along this lane. And he could see down there where the tank is. This strange object that had landed down there. Now, up until this point, he'd even thought that it might have been an aircraft in distress. But when he saw it, he saw that it had no tail, no wings. So he became extremely puzzled. Also at the time, in 1980, there used to be a hay shed that stood here. And you can see the remains of the foundations of it. And it was just basically legs and roof and the hay all stacked in the middle of it. Now the object, as it travelled across, you can see the house and the farm back in the distance there. It actually deviated off course and started to move towards this hay shed here. And then it corrected the path and headed back towards the water tank. This is the final gateway that George rode his bike up to, and you could see the object just back over this way where the water tank is over there. And he had to basically just shunt the gate open and then drive his little bike through. Now as George rode his little bike out here towards where the tank is, he started to tremble, and he described it as feeling like jelly. He started to lose strength in all his limbs, but he managed to hold it together. The object's power, or perhaps even its presence, was just affecting him in a way that he'd never experienced before. Everything was trembling, and he felt like really strange, and he could not fathom what it was that he was watching. But he did realise that he was probably looking at a UFO. In an interview that George did, he said that he rode his bike to the crest of the hill and the object was just sitting down on the rise. So we're approaching the place where he approximately would have been on the bike. Now he said he couldn't get any closer, and he rode up to about 50 feet of the object, about 15 meters away. And the sound was just so incredible that he could not possibly go any closer. So we're now out at the spot where the tank was located. This green tank is not the original one. The original one was a corrugated concrete tank, and it was about 12 feet across and about 8 feet high. A 10,000 gallon open water tank, and it sat in this very spot here. Now the object hovered above the tank. This tank is of very similar dimensions, and it hovered above the tank. It either landed on it or it just stayed above it, and it basically sucked all the water up and out of the old concrete tank that was here. Now the next day they found that the tank's silt had been spun up about 2 feet off the ground, and all the algae in the tank was pointing upwards. So all the water had been taken up out of the tank with real force, and also I think in a very rapid time as well. When you consider that George, from the time he saw the UFO round the corner and come down the laneway to the point where it hovered over the tank and then landed on the ground, that was 2 minutes in total. So this whole thing happened very quickly, but it did sit and wait on the ground until George would get out to this spot. So the object landed about 50 feet or 15 meters away from the tank, and where my lovely wife Tien is standing would have been marking the edge of where the actual landing circle was, and we've measured it out 15 meters from the tank. So this is where the circle was left behind. The circle was 28 feet across, and it had 6 spokes that came out, and the ground around the circle and in the spokes turned black or brown. And all the daisies, the fields were covered in yellow daisies, all the heads had been taken off in an anti-clockwise direction, right here at this location. Standing here today in the actual circle area that was here in September 1980 is really an incredible place to be. there's really no sign left of it here now, because after 43 years, this field's been ploughed and furrowed and all sorts of things have happened here over the last 43 years. But where I'm standing here is right where that circle would have been at that particular time. And when George approached on his bike, he could only get 15 metres away from it. At that point, the sound was so terrific, he had no possibility of getting any closer, and he clamped his ears with his hands. So that was really he was under a lot of physical stress just being within the presence of the UFO. Now, when it sat here, he noticed this big black ring start to appear under the object, and it rose up like it was inflating, like a big inner tube around the bottom of the object. And as it inflated, the noise started to scream, and it became so loud that it was really unbearable. Then there was a loud bang, and the big, what appeared to be rubber section started to go back underneath the object towards the center, and it rose off the ground to about 8 feet, and then it headed about 30 feet out towards the east. And at that point, all the rocks and the capeweed and the cow patties that had stuck to the bottom of it, they all fell off, and they were piled up just about 30 feet out this direction. So it was a very strange thing to observe. And when the object took off out over here, it didn't go any higher than about 100 feet off the ground. And all the cows that were here at the time, they had bolted right down here, and they'd gone through fences. They went over the railway line. They went down to the river, which is about at least 1 or 2 kilometres away down in this direction. You cannot underestimate how scared the cows were, how much they wanted to get away from the object. They just definitely wanted to get away from it. So the stock was just incredibly frightened at that time. So after the object departed from here, took off and headed off to the east, George hopped on his bike and rode to where this very distinct ring was on the ground. Now, you could see it was about 14 inches wide and about 28 feet around, or about 8 metres across, right here in this vicinity. And you could see that the grass, the daisy heads had all been shaved off, and the grass was just down the bottom. And it was basically, there was a blue tinge, and it was just a perfect circle here on the ground. He hopped on his bike and he rode back home again. Now, when he got home, he went to sleep, and he didn't sleep very well. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, he got back up out here, and he came back out to the site here to investigate what the hell had happened the night before. And at 9 o'clock, the farm owner, whose name was Ralph Anderson, he came to the farm, and George brought him out to here as well to see what had happened. Told him about the cows, told him that everything had been going crazy, and a truck driver had pulled up on the highway over here and came out and walked over to them and said that he had been followed by an object just before 1 o'clock in the morning between Traralgon and Rosedale. His truck had been pursued by something that came and followed him all the way from Traralgon to Rosedale. At the same time, a young girl, Kelly Postel, whose parents owned the Kilmany store, which was actually still operating at that time, she saw a pink object in the sky a little bit earlier that night. So there was also some additional supporting witnesses. Still out here today, you can see the rocks are on the ground, the cow patties are just the same. The grass was a lot greener and lusher at the time, and he said it was about 6 inches in height, so it was a very lush at that time in 1980. Currently, there's obviously been stock through here in recent times. The area has been harrowed as well. You can see the marks that have come along here to air the ground, but it effectively hasn't changed at all out here in that time. 43 years been a very long journey to get to this point where we can come out and make this video today. Over here behind the actual water tank, that's where all the cows had fled to, down towards the southeast. They had just taken off, running through fences, jumping over the railway line and running all the way down to the Latrobe River, which is down around where those trees are down there in the distance. They were incredibly spooked, and it took a week to herd them all back to the property. I say, it's just so incredible to be standing here in this spot after all this time. Not much has changed out here. It is really the same. The tank is situated up on a nice little rise here, and it goes down to the Princess Highway over there, and then it heads back gently down towards where the house is. So the distance from the house to this water tank is about 1 kilometre, or half a mile in the old speak, from where George had left his veranda and come down here to see where the object actually was. So as I end my days filming out here at Whiteacres, the property where George Blackwell had that incredible experience back in September of 1980, it's great just to reflect on what happened when he got back. So he came back to the house here, parked his little bike, he went inside, made himself a cup of coffee, and he didn't sleep very well for the rest of that night. In fact, he got up at 5 AM and went straight back down the laneway out to where the tank was, just to look at that circle on the ground again and reflect upon everything. But what he did notice when he got home was that his watch, his Timex watch, had stopped at about 1:10, and the whole experience took out to around about 1:50, but at 1:10 his watch had actually stopped. So he took it off and he put it on the bench inside the house here, and after about a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes, the watch started up again. He put it back onto his wrist and the watch stopped. And this continued for about 3 days. His watch had operated perfectly normal prior to that, and he started to become sick. So breakfast, he would throw up his breakfast, vomit up his breakfast every morning, and his evening meal was fine, no problems. And at 11 o'clock in the morning through to about 3 o'clock in the afternoon for the next 7 days, he actually had extreme headaches, which he never suffered from headaches at any point in time. He felt generally ill. This was probably no doubt a side effect of being so close to the UFO out in the field. He was trembling and shaking when he was out there on the bike. It was obviously having physical effects on him at the time, and he had a whole series of strange dreams. And on about the 7th night, he had a dream that the object was out there and he was holding a shotgun, and he woke up and he basically returned to normal at that point. So after 8 days after the experience, into early October, he felt like he was incredibly ill with symptoms that he never had before. Now, after he had been, after Ralph Anderson came along, who's the owner of the property, he went and told the Gippsland Times about this incredible encounter. And they came out here and did a front page news edition on George's experience. Channel 9 came down with their helicopter. They filmed here, flew the helicopter up and down the laneway, just following the general flight path of the UFO. And there were 2 investigations here. One was shortly after the experience when Viewforce came down. Pat Galea and Paul Norman came down, interviewed George. They came down, did all sorts of step-by-step through with him. And then a year later, Bill Chalker, Keith Basterfield and Gary Little came here and did a follow-up investigation about 12 months after the event. And the circle was still a bit visible at that time. I have to say now, 43 years later, that the circle isn't really visible out there. You're really only talking about pareidolia if you think you see something there. It just isn't really left after all that time. But coming here today, having the opportunity to come to George's house, to walk the farm laneway, to revisit the case in great detail, has been an absolute dream. And I thank Bruce and Colleen for letting us come out here today and film across the property. It's been really, really excellent.
Hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here with my darling husband Ben, and I always support him whatever he wanna do. Especially he loves this UFO investigation. I'm here for him. Very best today. He's so happy to watch this case open up again. Wish everyone enjoy day. My name is Pixie. Have a nice day.
So at the end of a great day's filming at the George Blackwell Whiteacres Rosedale water tank incident, the day has ended extremely well because I've actually located the original tank. When I was talking with Bruce, the current owner of the property, and I outlined to him exactly what had happened 43 years ago on his farm, he happened to mention to me that at the back of the property, the remains of an old corrugated concrete tank had been disposed of. Now that makes perfect sense, that when they cleared it out, they just took it down here to this dump pile right next to the Princes Highway. So here it is, folks, the actual tank on top of which that object landed all those years ago here at Kilmany. I'm so excited that I've found the actual tank from the incident, or what's left of it. When you think that 43 years ago, this pile of rubble here was the center of one of the world's best UFO encounters, it just boggles my mind. Now you can see that the tank was actually reasonably thick. It would have been about 4 or 5 inches thick with the Rio running through it. And it's that old style corrugated concrete type of tank that they made 50 plus years ago. But it sure is beautiful seeing it sitting here today. I honestly expected never to come in contact with the tank from Rosedale. But here we are with what remains. Absolutely amazing.